So here's Bob Chambers, who I told you became our chief pilot for the threes. And he was an early co-founder. He was responsible for a lot of our flight ops. The gentleman that he's talking to there is Harvey Stevenson, who was the attorney for Brenner Produce. And he became the attorney for our company. And toward the end of our company's existence, as we were going into receivership, he took my dad's place as president of the company. Here's Bob with his wife, Janet, and I believe probably their wedding picture and a wedding anniversary. This is the rest of the Chambers family, and I've met all but one of them, which is really delightful. They're a great family. And I've also met, let me see if I can get the pointer to work. This young lady right here is his granddaughter. So she's 3 generations of Veterans Air family. John Schoss also flew the DC-3. I've met John. He's a great storyteller. I've heard so many wonderful stories from John. And he loved to tell me that when he joined the Army Air Corps, he qualified to be both a bombardier and a pilot, and that some of the guys that had also were being inducted who were college educated weren't chosen to be both pilot and bombardier. So it was a point of pride for him. I met him in his home in New Jersey, and he told me he flew fish for the company. And I said, John, any chance those were lobsters? Because I knew we flew lobsters. Yeah, you're right, they were lobsters, he says. Well, he said, but I wasn't flying them to Florida. I only flew them to Teterboro. Well, the story really goes, because I knit these two things together, one or two of the flights, they were flying lobsters from Maine to Florida. And on 1 or 2 of the flights, the weather was so bad, they never got any further than either Teterboro or Newark. And my dad, on one of those occasions, brought the lobsters home. Now, we're live lobsters here, folks. He put them in an empty bathtub, because they only live in salt water. And by the time my mom got home, he was having a party for the entire neighborhood. None of these people we knew. I mean, we lived in this small little brownstone apartment in New Jersey, but he didn't want the lobsters to go to waste. That was Saunie. But the best story that John Schoss told me, last year, his high school, Ramsey High School in New Jersey, invited him to talk to the history class about what he did in the Second World War. But what they were really inviting him back for was to give him his high school diploma. He had enlisted before he enlisted thinking that the war wouldn't start and they wouldn't call him and he would get to finish high school, but he didn't. He was called like 2 months before he finished. And so when the high school was going through records and realized what the situation was, they gave him his diploma. When he called me on the phone, he was so excited he could barely talk. And this was a picture that ran in the local newspaper. So the DC-3s were originally intended to fly cargo, but we got to the point where we wanted to do passengers also. We did Florida snowbirds and the Cape in the summer. But remember, folks, that our DC-3s came to us as warbirds, and they had bucket seating initially, and we did a couple of flights down to Miami with those seats just like that. And then we decided maybe we needed to upgrade a little bit. And we didn't have the money to send them out to be refurbed, so our own guys did the interiors. And I saw an ad. Let me see if I can go back. I saw an ad that referred to that as the luxury DC-3. Somebody was a promoter. I have no statistics and no material that I found that talks to me about the routes that we actually flew the DC-3s on. But I do have 2 logbook entries, or 2 different logbooks. This one is Jack Stentner's, And it's showing that he was flying Newark, Miami in January, and which of the airplanes he was flying. The temporarily redacted we'll look at later. But I want you to look at the top. This man was a bomber pilot in the Second World War. And at the end of 45, he's flying an Aranca and a J3 to keep his hand in. He knew what he was doing. This is Jack. Jack is the first of my dad's men that I met personally. And he was the one that I had the ice cream cones with. The man had a sweet tooth. He had written a book on his memories of the Second World War, and there's an entire chapter in there about Veterans Air, and I learned a lot about the airline. I wish we had the time. I would read you a couple of snippets. Then the second logbook I had that helped show me what the DC-3s were doing belonged to Bernard Schmansky. And this first set of flights, kind of belies the fact that we were going to stay out of the northern area, because it goes from Newark to Memphis, Tulsa, Oak City, Chicago, Cleveland, Newark. That doesn't sound to me like they're dodging the high traffic area. And then they were doing sort of passenger luxury spots, Boston Spa and then Hyannis. So this was my only other record of what we were doing with the DC-3s. Bernard joined us toward the end of the company's history. He was flying August and September of 46, and he had also been an instructor and on the Martin B-26. He was offered a job by the post office, and he had a sense that maybe Veterans wasn't going to be flying much longer. And so he took the job, and he actually spent his entire career with the Postal Service. Smart man. This comes from a magazine article, and it's talking about our cargo ton miles and passenger miles. There are two asterisks that make this very difficult to figure out. But I want to show you this one other statistic. This is a quick story in July of 46 about the 17 larger operators that were getting more DC-3s, and that Veterans Air was getting DC-4s, and we were the only ones operating 2 DC-4s of the non-skeds. I'm going to take you back to this for just a second. I tried different calculations. I can't get these numbers to work out, and I've decided when I get home next week I'll start over again. John Greenleaf, accomplished pilot, P-51 pilot, thank you, and we needed men to run the business as well as to fly, and John was one of the men that did that. He was our general manager. I just got to show that picture of the airplane, because look at the grin on his face. This is his son, John Jr., and his daughter-in-law. There's a grandson, and there's a story there. His grandson one day Googles his own name on the internet, and up comes his grandfather and this company called Veterans Air. And he calls his dad and he says, "Dad, isn't this the company that Grandpa used to talk to us about?" And his father called me. Now, I created the website. You can visit us at veteransair.org, specifically for this reason, other than just to post what I was finding. But they were the first family that found me, and that was just really exciting. Robert Grease, another extremely qualified navigator. He flew, his bomber airplane was called Pregnant Peg, but he navigated for us too. The airplanes a little bit, but the business most especially. And he would come home and tell his wife, they don't know what they're doing. They really don't know what they're doing. And he's talking business-wise, not the flight operations. And I know that because I've met his wife, and she's told me the stories. But she's also told me that she used to go with him to work on Saturdays at Newark. And the passengers would be coming for the Miami flight, and she would greet them and get them settled in the DC-3, and you know how the nose is high and it's kind of a climb up to the seats. And I said, did they get you a uniform? Oh, no. She said, I didn't go anywhere. She said, it was just a fun thing to do while Bob was working. This is Marilyn. And I've been to Florida 3 times, twice in Gracie. That's my RV. And she's just amazing. She's a lot of fun. Okay, I'm going to pick up the pace here because I think I'm having too much fun. I mentioned flight manifests. I didn't know that there was such a thing. And I don't even remember now whose name I was researching. And it came up on something that looked like this that I dug out of Ancestry.com. And I'm looking at it, and it's written on it. And at the top, it says Veterans Airline. And this one was the Prague flight, okay, the first Prague flight. There are names on here that I'd never seen before. And I found 4 others out of the 6. So I found 5 out of the 6. And this one, the captain was Morgan Cooper Walker. And he brought us, when he joined Veterans Air, he brought Michael Fromm with him, but in a very strange way. He was ready to go to Prague. They don't yet have a navigator. And he's in the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C. And Michael Fromm comes from the Washington Post, where he's a staff writer, reporter. And Michael said he heard his name called. Michael, is that you? And he turns around, and it's Morgan Cooper Walker. They'd been on the same military base during the war, but they hadn't served together. And he said, I need you. I need a navigator. I need you now. Michael walked back across to the street of the Washington Post and said, I need a leave of absence. And the editor says, really? And he told him why, and he said, you can go as long as you promise to bring me back a story. And this is the first of a number of stories that Michael Fromm wrote. This one is on Prague. He also mentions the eggs that we brought home for President Truman's daughter. Michael he was always a writer. He became a journalist, then he became a conservationist, wrote like 17 books. The name of this book is Rebel on the Road and Why I Was Never Neutral. And that's a real good indication of what his personality was like. This is his daughter, Michelle, and she was the archivist between the 2 of us. Michael is the one that I didn't meet in person, but that I had correspondence with. His son, Will, and his wife, June, who in 1970 became an ordained minister of the Lutheran Church. It was right after the Lutherans allowed women to come into the ministry. She's 40 years a minister. And that's Mr. Bon Vivant there in the corner. That's Michael. This is the troop coming back from Prague. And because of the manifest, I was able to identify most of the men in this picture. When they went to Prague the second time, they only had one crew member that hadn't flown the first flight, so they were taking advantage of their experience. 70 years later, in May, Harry and I went to Prague, and I became a card-carrying member of the National Library of the Czech Republic. The librarians there were fabulous. They did work for me ahead of time. Before I got there, please look at that vaulted ceiling. I mean, that's the reading room in the library. It was just, and you could hear a pin drop. It's just gorgeous. But while I went through some of the materials that they gave me, I found this. And I had seen this photo in US papers, but here it was in a Prague paper with obviously a Prague story underneath it. Jack Stetner's logbook, again, this time we'll redact the top. He went to Warsaw, and this was the flight where we went behind the Iron Curtain. They picked up the baby chicks in Dayton. That's what they went from Newark to Harrisburg, Dayton, and then back to Newark, and then started the international flight. They went through Newfoundland and eventually Paris, Berlin, where they needed to get permission to fly, when Jack told you about that. And they spent 2 days on the ground and then turned around and came back. So it was pretty intense flying. Jack said that was the softest landing this DC had ever made. And trust me, the Warsaw runway had been bombed a lot and had only been temporarily patched, so they had to be really careful. And he said every chicken in Poland today is related to these. And he's almost right. There were other companies that were bringing the eggs, but and the other part of the manifest, which, since this is my missing one, was a story in the New York Times that mentioned Jakeman and Stettner as being part of the crew. John Knoll was the man that made the video that I showed you a moment ago. I found this article on him, that he had mastered many trades. He had done a lot of things, part of which was he became a clockmaker. And while he was with veterans, he got to help fix things. And later, after he was retired, he decided to fix this Cessna that had been in a wreck. 140, thank you. And there it is. Is that not some conversion? He did it for his grandson. And I know it's the same airplane because his daughter told me it was. That's Buffy in Dallas. And I've been in Buffy's home twice. She entertained Will Fromm and then also another Veterans Air family group. So this is Stettner. You've already seen him, my ice cream buddy. A lovely family, just a lovely family. And I didn't get to meet his wife, Dorothy, but son Scott in the striped shirt made this birthday card, life-size, for a party they were having for her. And yes, that is Fred Astaire, but that's photoshopped. But that was the vivaciousness of his wife, and the kids just absolutely adore her. So now here's the Warsaw II manifest, and Michael Fromm is on this flight, and you'll see the outcome of that. Richard Broughton has flown many of the flights. We're going to meet Richard here. He was a command pilot in the B-17s, flew for us, Prague twice, Warsaw once, and Athens. This was the Zooty Cutie and his crew. And when he found out that they were going to go to Berlin to get permission to fly to Poland, he said, land at Berlin's Tempelhof? I personally bombed that field out of existence 4 times. But there's our DC-4 in Berlin, so in fact, Richard went back to Berlin. They met at Veterans Air. She was selling tickets, and he was one of our pilots. And I met his 2 sons, and they kept telling me their mom used to sell flight tickets. And I said, was it at Veterans Air? Oh, I don't know. Turns out that that's where they met, and the boys didn't know that. So that was cool. Ed Martz. He's going to talk to you about Tempelhof, and I believe that my friend Cameron up in the booth there has boosted the audio on this. I wanted you to listen carefully, but I think you're going to be able to hear it. This is very short. Sorry. I'll try it again. No.
Tempelhof,
thank
right?
you.
Which was an exercise in concrete. Basically, the whole field was pretty much covered.
Covered with, I'm sorry?
A concrete overhead. It was covered up, and like a roof.
Describe that to me. I don't quite understand. It had a...
Okay, the airport, the whole airport really was covered with a big concrete roof.
How high were those roofs?
Well, I would say it was probably maybe 50 feet off the ground.
Whoa!
You mean I'm talking to myself? Do I need to repeat it? Or yes. He was a B-29 navigator, and when radar came in, he became an instructor at Bend Army Airfield in Kansas. Harry and I have been there. That's a whole different story. I have so many stories to tell you that I'm not going to tell you, and I already know that we're running behind here. I want to pick up the pace. You'll notice Riddle Airlines mentioned down there. After Ed flew for us, he continued flying air transport for a number of different companies, including Riddle Airlines. And when he was telling me, you know, these companies he flew for, and he kind of stumbled over the name Riddle, and I said, as in Embry-Riddle? Yeah, that sounds, yeah, that's small world. But the world gets smaller because this is Marie, his wife, and that was her voice in the background asking him how high the roof was at Tempelhof. This is his daughter who took over his insurance agency. I forgot. But the reason I'm even mentioning it, his insurance agency was on the second floor of a building in Madison, New Jersey, who on the first floor housed a dress shop owned by one of my very dearest friends. And I went there as often as I could because I was living out of state, but every time I went to New Jersey, I went to visit her. And I bought my wedding gown in her shop, and Ed was still running his business upstairs, and I had no idea. He'd been walking on my head all those years. It's just, what can I say?